Welcome back to Energy Explained, the family YouTube channel and podcast. I'm here with my father, Vikram Rao, who's joining us from outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Vikram is a authority on all things energy, at least in my mind. He has a PhD in engineering from Stanford University. He's the former chief technology officer of Halliburton, and he's a big energy geek, and he's a big environmental geek. And he spends his time, I think, reading. What do you do? What do you spend your time doing every day? Just reading and writing? What's your average day, actually?
Well, actually, I'm writing my 5th book right now, and it's hitting the editorial correction phase. And yeah, I do follow the environmental literature, the news, and part of what we do here is so what are the things that are appearing in the news that might have underlying science that the public may not be fully aware of, and so that's pretty fun thing to look for, So I just found this one on wildfires, which is what we'll be talking about today.
Well, yeah. So we can jump right into it. No, and you certainly are an inspiration to me in terms of continuously learning and broadening out your portfolio, writing books post retirement in quotes. But let's jump into our topic today. So we're here to talk about wildfires, and wildfires are in the news seemingly in the summer constantly, and they have been happening, obviously, for all of recorded history, but they are in the news with a greater intensity, and we see not just on the North American continent, but in Australia, in other places that have dry, hot weather, they're becoming more prevalent and more disruptive, at least from a layman's interpretation, just from the side, more disruptive to society. The Oregon wildfire that's burning now has really hit the news. But can you sort of break us down some facts? And sort of my take is they become more disruptive and a bigger deal. But, have the quantity of wildfires gone up in the last 30, 40 years since we've been really studying it closely?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question because the number of wildfires, by and large, has been constant for the last 30 years, the number. But the area burned has gone up by more than double. So you might well ask, well, what's going on here? So what's going on here is that until fairly recently, the main reason for ignition was human.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, makes sense.
So statistics, a recent paper in 2015 and then 2018 showed that in California and south of France, statistics showed that 95% of all ignition was due to human behavior, like 4 different ones we can get into if we want, but they were all human related. And since behavior tends not to change, one could readily understand that the ignition number has not changed. Okay, but what has changed is that the intensity has changed, and that is what is super interesting to scientists, is that the area burned. So most statisticians and scientists look at the area burned. They're not as concerned with numbers.
Okay, so is it, now you sort of got in there a little bit with most wildfires are started by people in some fashion, intentionally, unintentionally, carelessness, and so on and so forth. Now, it sounds like you're saying 2 things are going on. One is that when a fire is starting, it's burning, it's to a greater degree. It's burning more acreage because of climate change, presumably, I'm assuming. And the second, which you're going to get to, is as you just mentioned, the non-human sources of fires are going up. So is it both effects? Is it really that, there's just sort of accidents are going to matter more now? I think we all read about the gender reveal party in California that turned into a complete mess. Maybe 30 years ago, a wetter forest, that doesn't happen, even though there would be a small fire. Is that the kind of idea that both of these effects are playing a role?
Yep, absolutely. So first, let's talk about the 4 primary human-related things. One is campfires. The other, surprisingly, is arson. In fact, it's surprising, but it's true. The third one is called equipment, which means like chainsaw, the sparks from chainsaws and stuff like that.
Okay.
And the fourth one is power lines falling down due to wind or whatever. These are the top four, and they're all human related. Even the power lines, you have to argue is human related.
Sure.
But
no humans, no power lines.
Do much about. So now, how intensity? Intensity has been going up primarily because the amount of fuel has been burning up. So what is fuel? Fuel here in this case is scrubby little stuff under the canopy that catches fire. Okay, these are grasses, little trees, kindling, stuff like that. That has been going up due to dry conditions, which are seemingly climate change related. So since the fuel has gone up, the intensity has gone up because that fuel burns longer and harder, then the trees go up. Otherwise, they may die out, and all you get is blackened tree trunks. So climate change appears to have increased the amount of fuel.
Okay, and when we think about wildfires and the environmental disruption and the human disruption, if a lot of people might say, "Well, I don't live in those areas," or even if you live in those areas, I used to live in San Diego, obviously, as you know, and I lived close enough to the water that there was just no chance the fire ever reaching me. Like it would reach a lot of suburbs. Like there was nothing to burn between me and the forest, right? There's just too much humanity. And so, although one year I had terrible smoke, it was never something that was like, well, that's never going to burn my house down. So when we think of the disruption, how much of the disruption or the damage is actual disruption, people's houses burning down, versus environmental damage associated with more and more wildfires?
Right. So obviously the different buckets.
Yeah.
So the mortality is not that much directly due to fires, but there's a lot of property damage. But the bigger damage, actually, I don't know if it's bigger or not. I'll look at what are my notes in the book. But there's no question that there's a lot of health effects due to the particles generated from the fires. And the health effects can be felt thousands of miles away because these particles go downwind and go considerable distances. But the part that is particularly unfortunate is that smaller particles will go further. I mean, it's pretty intuitive. Bigger particles settle out.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Smaller particles go further. Well, smaller particles, so-called PM 2.5, I hate to use jargon, but 2.5 micrometers or smaller are considered the most injurious to health. Those small guys can go considerable distances. And then there's something called ultrafine nanoparticles, which is a subset of PM 2.5. That goes even further because they're even lighter, and they're even more toxic. Here's the deal. The real effect of a forest fire is much greater in scope of how far it affects than the immediate area. The immediate area has serious privation of a direct kind, but the indirect part, which is more unseen, so to speak, because in some cases you don't need to see a haze in order to know that there's particles. See, so to give you an idea, if you see a haze, it is because the particles are in what's called the visible wavelengths, okay, which is, it doesn't matter, okay, 400 nanometers and bigger, okay. But those 400 nanometers are bigger, not as noxious as the 100 nanometers smaller. So if you see a haze, you say, I shouldn't be breathing this stuff in. Well, sorry to tell you, but if you don't see a haze, it doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that they're not affecting visible light.
Now, what type of health effects are precipitated by these micrometer-sized particles?
Right. So the PM 2.5, it's just about name it. Okay. One of the reasons that they are noxious, the smaller particles, 2.5 micrometers and smaller, is that they go far into the lung, deep into what is known as the alveoli, and therefore they can cause lung disease, and that's the beginning. Some of them, and then the littlest guys, which is the nanoparticles, are small enough that they can enter the cell, penetrate the cell wall.
I see.
And and it does even so that does damage to the entire body, even to the brain. Okay, so because it can cross the blood-brain boundary, and so you might ask, okay, so what are these things and why are they so toxic? I can tell you if you really want. Yeah, I'll tell you. So initially, when it comes off the burn, they're really soot, carbon. Okay, but the volatile organic chemicals in the air will attach themselves to it. They're highly reactive, these surfaces. So it's the organic surfaces that are toxic, not just the carbon. And so the amount and intensity of the organic surfaces matter.
So this is why if you're sitting at a campfire, you're not exposing yourself to this type of risk, because there's not this sort of nucleation of the other pollutants and so forth, what's in the air in a city. But if you're in a city and you're 1,000 miles away from the Oregon fire, if you're in the right wind drift, you could be exposed to this. And it's something that, I think, at least to my knowledge, coal power plants as an example, all the health effects weren't known for 20, 30 years of living near these places, because these are long, you don't just drop dead from it. You die 20 years early. And then you had all these studies of, well, I'm just going to look at people located in certain areas and wow, they're dying at these incredibly high rates. And then you put it together, okay, you can't live here and so forth. And you have to have these, and obviously power plants got cleaner. And so this is one of those things that we might underestimate the risk. Interestingly, I remember, we talked about nuclear power. And we were growing up, and when I was growing up, Chernobyl happened, 3 Mile Island happened, and everyone was super concerned in Europe of living downwind of nuclear power plants because this could happen. But this sounds like this is a much more realistic risk for people.
Oh, way more. Nuclear reactor accidents are very rare. When they happen, like Chernobyl, it's a big disaster, but they're very rare. No, this is this unfortunately is happening all the time. And to your point about long term, that's exactly right. In fact, let's talk about short term effects. So the bigger particles called PM10, okay, so particles which are more than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, are not as bad for mortality, but are for morbidity. So asthma and so forth will be worsened. So short-term effects will be from the bigger particles. To some degree smaller, there will be short-term effects. There will be because they're entering the lungs. And so you would see more, asthmatics will be more impaired.
Sure.
But the bigger deal is much later, correct, as you said. It's from the morbidity and the mortality due to actual cellular damage.
But now what can people do? So what you've explained to us is most fires historically are started by people, either on purpose or on accident. And they're burning longer and harder now because of more dry brush at the bottom of the forest floor due to more extreme weather, most likely due to climate change. Now, that means you're exposed to more and more of this stuff. What can you do? Because, well, you're not Smokey the Bear. You can't prevent, yes, you can prevent forest fires if you're out there in the forest, but if you're out in a city, you can't prevent, like we are, you can't prevent forest fires. So what should a responsible person do? Do you follow the news and understand when these particles might be there and wear a mask? Like what is it? Do you have to be more informed and protect your health in a more active way when there are fires burning in a place near you and stay informed? Is that your best advice?
No. I think best advice is more global, shall we say. So first of all, one of the reasons that the fire burns so much, I told you, was the underbrush.
Yeah.
So almost all forests should do what's called controlled burns. It's well known how to do them, but many don't, okay? And controlled burns are where you deliberately burn all that underbrush, take the fuel away as much as possible. Then the intensity will go down. So that's point one. Every community, every government should work hard at instituting control burns. So that is the main thing that we've done. The other is that the more recently, the big fires, this fire that we're talking about in Oregon, and then last year, essentially the largest fire ever. It did, I think, 1 million acres, was in the so-called August complex fire in California. And that was started by lightning. Okay, and so was this one. So the interesting question is then, what is this all about lightning? You told me the 95% was by humans. Lightning is not humans. That is correct. Until recently, lightning strikes were responsible for, I want to throw a number out, 2 or 3%, okay, of the ignition. Now it appears that the biggest guys are due to lightning strikes.
Wow.
So what the heck is going on? So then I did some research on this, because we know lightning is due to thunderstorms, and thunderstorms have rain. So what's going on? And I did the research. Research told me that even 0.1 inches of rain will be enough to either prevent ignition or to douse it quickly.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So what's going on? So what's going on is something called dry lightning. Nobody's heard about this. I never heard about it till I researched it, okay? And dry lightning is lightning without rain. Okay, how does that happen? Okay, well, how it happens is if the ambient temperatures are very high, then that rain does happen, never hits the ground. It evaporates before it hits the ground. And so high ambient temperatures equates to what? Probably to climate change. Okay, I'm not here to proselytize one way or another, but I think a lot of folks would say climate change increases the temperatures. Let me give you a fact. August Complex fire was on August 16th last year. August 16th last year was their second strike. There are 38 strikes, by the way, lightning strikes. August 16th was also when Death Valley, California had the highest temperature ever recorded on the planet, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you want to draw a line between them? Be my guest. I'm not going to draw the line, but I'm going to say there may be a line there, okay, between extreme heat and dry lightning. So I think there's stuff going on. So then what can people do? Do more about climate change.
Yeah, I hear you, and it sounds like these controlled burns. It's a classic situation where if most of the pain is felt by people not in the immediate area, there'll be an underinvestment in this type of stuff because the people in the immediate area feel only a fraction of the damage, and therefore it's sort of classic public good. So we have underinvestment in controlled burns, increased risk of new ignition possibilities, dry lightning. I can understand why these might cause the biggest fires, because presumably if someone has a campfire that goes overboard, they call in the people very soon. It's in areas where vehicles can access and so on and so forth, where it's it's a little more of a situation that's easier to handle. So it sounds like there's some elements in place. Well, it's interesting to hear how connected everything is with a new weather phenomenon, wildfires, everything, really linking back to the changing and more extreme weather we're facing, linked to climate change. And I think climate change, it really is a prevalent story in a lot of our episodes. So anything we missed here, or is that the sort of the whole story? The whole story?
That's about the whole story. I mean, there's a small point that it matters which kind of wood burns, but that's a detail that we don't need to get into.
Well, all right. Then we thank our listeners for joining us for this episode. We'd like to remind everyone we're available on all major podcasting platforms, or on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. And what we sort of like to do is say, hey, hit subscribe, hit like, share it with your friends. Of course, we're out here just father and son team, purely voluntary basis. So we do it for fun, but we appreciate all the feedback we're getting. And until next time, we'll see you then.